Hi, Elizabeth here, production assistant for the PodRocket podcast. Before we dive in, did you know that PodRocket is on YouTube? You can catch the full video versions of our episodes over on the LogRocket YouTube channel. Click the link in the description to tune in and subscribe so you never miss an episode.
As funny as all the vibe stuff is, so much of real life is like that. Humans as engineers, as people building products, go through this LLM development process. It is this self-realization process that oftentimes humans are just making guesses based on their intuition. And then as soon as you work with LLMs, you're reminded that we're just like guessing.
Hi there, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. My name is Paul Mikulskis, and joined with me today is Logan Kilpatrick. He is the group product manager over at Google DeepMind, and we're going to be talking about everything Gemini today. In this episode, Logan and I go over a brief overview of the new Gemini models releasing in June, along with some talk on some new music and multimodal capabilities. And of course, getting an inside look into how the Google DeepMind team is seeing the landscape of AI tooling, hardware, industry trends for developers changing now and over time. So join us as we dive deep into the depths of Google DeepMind with Logan Kilpatrick. Excited to have you on the podcast, Logan. Excited to pick your brain.
Thank you, Paul. I'm excited. It's going to be a fun conversation. There's a million things coming out of Google these days. So hopefully this conversation will be helpful for folks who have maybe seen a little bit of it or seen none of it or are just generally curious about all the stuff that we're doing.
There was a really interesting infographic I'd noticed the other day. It's like all the things Google is doing right now. And the thing looked like it was sort of fine, where's Waldo? Because there's so much going on. So good. We can really zero in on some of the things people are really excited about. Everybody gets excited about AI because it lets you build stuff. And it's not just Gemini 2.5. I do want to make sure we're not just repeating Google I/O and talking about the things that are out, but hopping right into that whole gamut. Let's find our entry point. What is something on the AI side, Logan, that was very compelling or you think people maybe don't know a lot about that they announced? Because Gemini 2.5 is that flagship. But man, when I was reading the blog post, I was like, wow, you guys are working on that too? Crazy.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the ones that we haven't talked a lot about, lots of like very visible, cool things like Gemini Diffusion and updated Gemini 2.5 Pro and other things like that. But one of the cool ones was around, we released a Gemini 2.5 Flash text-to-speech model. I can send a link for folks or we can put it in the show notes or something like that. But in AI Studio, if you go to generate media, I think on the left-hand side, and then there's a tab for like text-to-speech. And inside of that, you can dynamically generate these like really natural sounding, almost like podcasts type of content. So if you've used the Notebook LM experience before and audio overviews, which people have really fallen in love with this form factor, we actually have a API developer experience, which allows you to create content like that in this like really natural sounding way. So I think it's like not the full Notebook LM type of experience. Like you do have to make the transcripts yourself and then you bring the transcripts in and we give you the audio model in order to create that content. But I'm really excited to see where that goes. And we haven't, just because there was so much stuff happening at Google I/O, we haven't talked a lot about this, but folks can try it out right now, which is a ton of fun.
And previously, this was not available via an API offering, correct?
Exactly. This is the first time that we're making it available in the API. And then we have a developer playground to test out some of those capabilities inside of AI Studio.
And this reminds me of one other thing I noticed in the blog audio stuff, music. Right? That's the thing you guys are doing too now.
Yeah. So Lyria is our music model, and we have some really interesting experiences to bring the music model to life. So if you go to inside of AI Studio, if you go to the build tab, there's a bunch of pre-built like small starter apps that are powered by Lyria, and you can play around with them and you can see what that experience looks like. There's like a prompt DJ and you can experience what Lyria can actually do. So it's super interesting. Obviously, we're super Gemini focused, but we also have this like whole sort of slew of bets across generative media, everything from VO3, which got announced, to Imagine 4, to Lyria, to some of these text-to-speech and audio variants of the Gemini model. So there's lots of stuff in that category to spend time looking into.
So some of these models are interesting. It's just text, right? You read it, have it on a piece of paper. It's an image. I see it. There's the blueprint. Something like Lyria, when I get something from that model, I'm actually getting two pieces of property. I'm getting the sound recording of what I'm hearing, and then I'm getting the composition of what was created. Is there any difference between these like new models that might have 2-3 pieces of US property tied behind it versus something that just a Gemini model coming out? How are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Lyria is definitely a fundamentally different model. It is interesting to look at like architecturally, and maybe I haven't looked at Lyria as closely, but like Veo and Gemini as an example, architecturally actually have a lot of similarities, which is interesting to see this in practice. I think the future looks a lot like there's a single model that does this stuff. So I do think we're getting closer and closer to that world. Like I think we're seeing this with some of these image generation capabilities where eventually it just is like all part of the main model. I think we've seen this with audio capabilities where the model has now gotten probably just as good at some of these domain specific custom modality models with audio as is in the mainline Gemini model. I do think there's some interesting properties to music that maybe make that slightly more difficult, but by and large, I think we're getting a lot closer to the models just doing all the modalities. Because like music is a sub case of audio. So I think as the models get really good at that, I think they start being able to do music. I think music just has a lot of like intellectual property situations that make it more complicated than some other domains.
Yeah, certainly. The industry doesn't make it easy. Okay, turning to the flagship, the popular kids, we got Gemini 2.5 Pro and then Flash. So right before this podcast, I was asking Logan, this isn't the May 6th one. This is a new one. He affirmed to me, yes, it is. And it's probably going to be the flagship one. So why is there another update? How is it different than that May 6th one? Because that was the one where developers were like, oh my gosh, it's like not messing up all the time. And I can send it this huge context. And I think that was a big moment for Gemini 2.5. So I'm curious how that's being pushed, especially for the developer audience.
Yeah, this is a great question. So with 2.5 Pro, we've had 3 iterations now. We started with the original 0325, which was March 25th. We launched the first version of that model. Developers loved that version. There was a bunch of things that didn't work well about it, which weren't, interestingly, we got some feedback about this, but it wasn't like overwhelming feedback. We knew what the gaps were. So the 05, the May 6th version of the model, we wanted to try to close a bunch of those gaps. We also wanted to keep pushing code performance. I think our Pro model, the magic right now is in a lot of these coding use cases. So we're like, what would it look like if we keep pushing code performance? And for that model, actually at the cost of some other capabilities. So there was like some small regressions across different capabilities in the interest of trying to really push code as far as we could. And we got lots of feedback that, hey, actually those small regressions were in use cases that people really cared about that weren't code related. Some of them were like code adjacent. So I think one of the positives from that was like that our evals actually track the feedback that we saw. That was not an unexpected piece of feedback because we saw that in a bunch of the evals. And then this latest release, which came out last Thursday on June 5th, was intended to close all those gaps between the March version and the May version and actually push quality even further across a bunch of dimensions. So we saw all the feedback that folks gave us and we fixed a bunch of that stuff. So I think this should be the sort of strongest, most balanced version of the model. We fixed a bunch of function calling stuff, with which folks had given us tons of feedback on. Code performance has continued to go up. So it's, I think overall, is by far the best 2.5 Pro model that we've ever shipped, metric-wise, quality-wise, et cetera. So I'm really excited for this to hopefully be the one that sticks around. And I'll also make a tangential comment, which is, I think we've also heard the feedback that people don't necessarily want all of these iterations. Definitely caused a lot of like work for our teams internally. I think it causes a lot of churn for like external developers who are like trying to adopt these models. So I do think the future looks more and more like us not doing this iteration cycle. I think we're getting more robust with like ways in which we get feedback from the external world to make sure that when we release a model, it's a really great, strong model across the dimensions that people care about. And we can do that iteration in private versus doing it in public. Because I think the public version, like, there's a real cost. It is nice in some cases, but it definitely has a cost.
Yeah, I mean, when there's a lot of models coming out, even somebody who's programming it like myself, I've been using it to make some workflows recently, external marketing crap. Between the versions, the little minutiae can change. And then even your downstream customers has to go and retry everything. And nothing's more arduous than testing like deterministic LLM chain and watching it tick for 6 minutes. And you're like, okay, time to try again. So having that sounds really great for a consumer like myself. I'm like, wow, that's cool. It'll change a little bit less. And when I do want to change, it's deliberate. So 2.5 Flash, would you consider that like the younger brother to 2.5 Pro? Is it a comrade that doesn't run as far into the battlefield? Like, I've always wondered, is it as deep? Like, how do you guys internally view the relationship and the proposed business value between those two guys?
I think this is a good question. Sort of the relationship between all the different models matters a lot, and it's something that we think about a lot. I think one sort of quick meta comment, which is I think part of this challenge has been that the positioning really does shift over time. I think if you look back historically, like the story we were telling with 2.0 Flash was it was the fastest, cheapest model that we had available. It was the workhorse model. It was actually really good performance-wise at the Pareto frontier. I think if you look at the 2.5 Flash story, like that model is materially better across so many dimensions that like I think the challenge with the model positioning is as the intelligence keeps going up, like that intelligence increase puts pressure on all of the model positioning because the models have just gotten so good, especially with reasoning. They've gotten just so fundamentally good at so many different use cases. So now I think this is evolving. Like my mental model is that 2.5 Pro is really the like state-of-the-art frontier, most difficult possible things you could throw at where you're actually not super cost constrained. And I think there's actually the challenge is there's only few domains where that's actually the case. And I think like coding tends to be one of those just because it's like such a high economic value activity that it's worth putting a lot more money into solving certain tasks. 2.5 Flash, I think now, you see the GA candidate for 2.5 Flash, it really is like the most balanced reasoning model that exists. It's, I think from a quality perspective, it's near state of the art. Like it's actually closed a lot of the gap to 2.5 Pro, which has been interesting to see just because it's such a powerful model. The model has gotten so good, it forces us to change the positioning. So it's definitely the most balanced, most like reasonable reasoning model that we have available today. And I think developers are really going to like it for so many different use cases. And then at the last end of the spectrum, we have 2.5 Flash Lite. And I think for 2.5 Flash Lite, it's definitely the most like cost-effective, fastest model we have available. The model actually does have reasoning capabilities, so you could use it for reasoning workflows, but it's really meant as the place for people who are migrating from 2.0 Flash or even 1.5 Flash still or 2.0 Flash Lite to have a place that sort of feels familiar, is relatively the same price point as before, and is really optimized for like speed while still maintaining some of the quality wins. So I think again, it's been interesting because even that positioning changes as soon as you turn on reasoning. And like we have this debate internally, just having this conversation today actually about should reasoning be on by default for this Flash Lite model? Like it was trained as a reasoning model from scratch to begin with, but what's the developer expectation when they show up in this model? And I think there's a sort of argument on both sides, but I think where we've landed is we really want this model to be the place where people who aren't using reasoning can make a clear migration to very easily. If you want the reasoning capabilities, you can turn them on. So yeah, it's become more and more complex over time to do this model positioning stuff, which is always fun.
And it's not an uncommon problem. Like anybody making these models right now, I know like Anthropic, they struggle with the same thing. It's dynamic, it's changing, and where it situates its business value is, it's also up to how people use it. Like how are your downstream consumers drawing value from it will totally change the way you frame it as well, I'm sure. One thing that really surprises me is like with 2.5 Flash, right? It's so fast. It blows my mind how fast it is. I've been using it in some like email workflows recently, and it's just like testing it is the best with 2.5 because it's just the whole workflow runs in like under a minute versus several minutes. And it feels like 80% of my concerns or 90% of my needs get satiated with a model like 2.5 Flash. And you go, wow, like, do I need that like last 10%? Like it's just knocking most of the stuff out. And the dollar per knowledge is fantastic. Do you guys find, because you're in it, you're in Google DeepMind, you're the best person to answer this question, that knowledge in these models is almost like asymptotic? I don't know if that's the right way for me to say that word, but it's like that, like at work, you do 80% of the job. It's like, you can probably ship it at some point, you know? Do you guys, are you experiencing that in these models? Do you think that'll continue similar to how you're seeing multimodal converge? Is there going to be convergence on that asymptote of how complex the knowledge is?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. It is definitely something that I've talked to folks about before. Like the two dimensions to this that I think about is like one, oftentimes, actually maybe on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have cases where the evals are, for like the base models, the evals are like 2% better. And like as a human, I sit there and I think, okay, 2%, that doesn't matter. Like the 2% difference between X, Y, and Z versus for this use case is actually just like hard to grok in a lot of cases. And it's not easy to put a finger on what is 2% better about something. But oftentimes, if you look at like the Flash versus Pro use cases, that 2% on an academic eval, like how that translates into the level of reliability for certain use cases is actually pretty material. And now I think actually, and this is historically wasn't the case, but now with reasoning, what ends up happening is that 2% change in like base model performance gets magnified because of those reasoning capabilities. So you could start with something that's 2% better and it actually ends up being like 10% better for a specific use case or 15% better because you layer on the reasoning capability. And I think it's just like in general been really interesting to see that trend play out. And that's why like from a model development standpoint, I think there's so much. Google hasn't stopped investing in like pre-training and post-training and all this other stuff because reasoning works really well, but reasoning is like it's an amplification of the model's base capability. So it's totally worth the effort because it's going to be amplified so much. And I think this ends up being even more and more true over time because it's not just the model that's solving this problem. It's the model with a system. And like the system is in many ways exacerbating the performance of the model in a bunch of these different cases. So it will be really interesting to see how this plays out. And your experience tracks with my experience as well. I do think there's a lot of cases where I'm like, you clearly don't need pro. Like Flash does the job for a lot of people. And you oftentimes need a little bit of exploration to really find the cases where, oh, actually, you know what, pro is materially better for this certain type of email use case as an example. So yeah, it'll be interesting to look through.
This kind of brings me to a huge open question right now that everybody's trying to solve right now, which is tooling. And now I have to ask about Google AI Studio because we've all been there. We've spent time in there. We've minted API keys, done prompts, histories, all that, touched all the buttons. But at the end of the day, when you're building a scalable full stack system that's trying to be as production ready as it can be based on these things, it's the Wild West. Like, how do I track my prompts? How do I see those edge cases? You really have to spend time as a team building out those unit tests and running it through the prompt and then tweaking a little bit. Does Google have plans to help the developer community up this vector? I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we've been evolving like as the sort of maturity of the ecosystem goes up and also just like the maturity of specifically our customer base. Like historically, the main sort of battle that we were fighting was like get people excited about Gemini, help them understand the capabilities of the models. And I think we've gone through that phase. Like people want Gemini models. They're really good. They're strong on a bunch of different things. People sort of generally know what the capabilities of the model are. I think the next step of this journey for AI Studio is like, how do we as a platform become a place where we can actually help developers who are putting Gemini into production get all the things that they need in order to do that successfully and with the right levels of tooling and such. So I think we will have more and more things like prompt management and evals and et cetera, which I'm personally excited about because I think those things then downstream trickle back to the use case of exploring what are the models good at. You just have more infrastructure in order to help answer that question. And right now it's like very vibe based, whether or not the model is doing the thing that you think it's doing well. So yeah, it has been interesting to see that transition for us internally.
The vibe based quality control it's something else.
It is.
It really is.
The real challenge is there's, as funny as all the vibe stuff is, so much of real life is like that. Humans as engineers, as people building products, go through this LLM development process. Like it is this like self-realization process that like oftentimes humans are just making guesses based on their intuition. As a human, that's so native to what we do. We just forget that's part of what we're doing. And then as soon as you work with LLMs, you're like reminded that, wait, why are we doing this like this? We're just like guessing as far as what the thing is. And it's like hard to, I talk to so many companies who are using LLMs and they're like, yeah, we don't use evals because like it's non-determinate. It's like really hard to articulate what that thing looks like. But like we have people on the team who can, when shown something, can actually answer the question of whether an artifact is good or not. But encoding that into an actual like system is really difficult to do.
And it's not like that's going to be a static problem that gets solved because that is a problem of what is the human element of quality. And that's a boundary that is non-static and will always be pushed. Now, what about hardware? I know Google is pioneering that vector of the AI growth here. Is that going to affect the way the models converge or do not converge in comparison to other competitors in the market? Training on maybe completely different hardware stacks, being deeply in the product research space. Logan, do you see differences right now under the hood and how they are emerging and finding their quality?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I just tweeted a picture this morning of my TPU V4 and my TPU V5, which I have as little, I can go and run and grab them if you want to see them. My little TPU cubes, which is cool.
Very cool. That's
I,
super
I,
neat.
I do think this is like a fundamental part of Google's infrastructure advantage having played out over like the TPU investment happened over 10 years ago. It was like 2015, I think, when the first TPUs came online, and like does make a material impact on how Google builds these models and goes to market. And I think like actually it's not only a TPU story, but I think like long context is an interesting example of this, where like the infrastructure advantage that Google has, long context as a model capability is like dependent on infrastructure. It's not easy from an infrastructure perspective to make long context work. At the model level, it works, but you need all this other stuff in order to support the infrastructure for that. So it is like very much like a TPU story playing out relative to, some of our competitors. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why we still have the biggest context window by an order of 10x relative to our competitors. So it's been cool to see that advantage play out. And I have to imagine that it is part of the story of why the models aren't going to converge, is because people are using different infrastructure, different stacks, different levels of different like levels of the infrastructure. It's cool to see. I think the world doesn't really want the models to converge. I don't think that's the best thing for the world.
No, I mean, you get the best quality code output where you send it to one and then the other and then the other. And then, it's amazing how that's a difference. And speaking of perspective, so you didn't mention in 2.5, this new version, you saw code go up, right? In the last one, you guys were optimizing for that. And now you're saying, let's close the gap. So let's get all the other things to that same level and push it even more as far as we can. Do you think that the rising up of the other modalities, the other ways it can reason about information is going to change the way that like a developer like myself or somebody else on your team might interface with it? Because there's been times in the past where you go, I will personally call a SWAT team, put you in jail, have them like waterboard you if you don't get this right. That kind of went down in terms of how effective that was. But it's just interesting how what it's trained on, what it's good, what it's not at in a general sense can change the way you interact with it emotionally to get a better output. Do you foresee any changes like that in this new June release compared to the last one?
Yeah, they're probably less pronounced, I think, in this June release. I think the general ecosystem, I think if you look at why there's been some like good research as to like why people had to do those things to get the models to be reliable. I think like the model labs have heard a lot of that feedback. And I think that's why you just don't have to do that as much anymore. Yeah, it is like moving away from looking at data that it was exactly trained or intended on like human. I think this is an artifact of the original data was like human to human data. And like now we have AI to human data. So like there's just a lot of the constructs aren't the same. So it is like a somewhat different, divergent way of communicating with the models, though in general, it's like roughly the same still. So I don't think there's any like big differences in that sense from the most recent version of the model. But I do think over time, we are going to continue to see like the difference in the way that people interact with the models. And I think the models will be more, my personal hope, and I think we'll see how this plays out on the research side. My personal hope is that the models are better at getting what they need from you in order to like actually help you solve the problem at hand. I think like historically, just because the way LLMs are trained, they're so interested in just like answering the question that you ask them. And oftentimes, like I guess humans do this a bit where we just answer the question, but I think there's a lot of conversations, like good conversations, where like someone pushes back or asks clarifying questions or does all these other things. And to me, that's like a feature. That's not like the model not being good in answering your question. That's the model doing what it needs to do, which is get the required information in order to like successfully answer your question. So I think we'll see more and more of that over time. And I think that's going to look much more like how humans interact with humans today.
That's going to be really neat to see. 11 Labs just came out with 2.0 and it will interrupt you. It has this new interruption API, which is first of its kind that we've really seen. It's getting a lot of great feedback because it's that pushback. It's the rubber ducking effect. It's fantastic to have that. I have so many more questions for you, but we have a quick round. And I got to fire some quick questions at you, Logan, because they're going to help me and they're going to help some of our listeners too. So here's the first one. What's the point of user friction that you feel like arises due to misinformation or lack of knowledge of your product?
Yeah, maybe a sort of alternative to this is I think with reasoning models, we have this like dynamic thinking where the model will figure out the right thinking amount to think for a given query. And there's a lot of interesting data. And actually, some of it just came out like yesterday or early this morning about what happens when you sort of manually configure that parameter. So I think maybe it's something that folks aren't doing manually that they should be doing, which is go into the thinking budget and play around for your use case how much the model should think, and then see how much that differs from what the default that the model thinks it should be spending on a certain problem. Because I do think there's a little bit of a divergence in that case.
That was great. I'm sure a lot of people benefit from that one. Hidden knobs and levers to pull. Okay, so next one. People will say that the most dangerous fire alarm is a fire alarm that always goes off, because then you ignore it. It just kind of goes under the hood. So in a similar light, we can think about data maybe being dangerous. And there's obviously dangerous data. There's data you could feed into a model and go, I am definitely going to annihilate all humans, and have it go, yes, all the time. Like that could arguably be dangerous. But in more of the sleuthy danger sense, what's some data that you and the team need to constantly be on the lookout for that might feel right, but it has downstream effects that worry you guys? Or maybe worry is the wrong word. Things that developers might want to be aware about when they're interfacing with these models, producing things. And it's just because of the way our world is and the way you can collect and then train information on it.
Yeah, that's a good question. The biggest tension point for Google is we have so many customers across so many different domains. And it's like, how do you balance the needs of Google search at the same time that you're balancing the needs of some random developer building something? And constant, that's a non-trivial problem, and something that is like a constant challenge for us to make sure that we do right. And I think the team is more and more finding value and using a bunch of the proxies we get from developers as like the North Star for a lot of stuff, just because the needs of developers are so varied. But yeah, I think maybe that's not a direct answer to some of the data that we're trying to avoid, but I think the thing that we in general trying to avoid is like getting too over-indexed on certain stuff. In a lot of cases at the sort of cost of making the model generally better for certain tasks.
Cool. That was interesting to hear. Over and it's like the overfitting question.
Yeah,
almost.
100%.
Yeah. Okay. So now I want to ask what a big misconception devs might have about AI, specifically Gemini. If we were taking this podcast like 6 to 12 months ago when the dev scene really kicked up on this stuff, I think the answer is easy. The answer would have been, you can't trust everything. Yeah, no, that's like a no. Of course, thanks. We're past that now. I want to know what's other misconceptions in a similar sleuthy sort of format or flavor that you think people should be aware of when they're daily driving these.
Yeah. I think my sort of general comment to this is that the misconception that developers have is that Gemini is not like the best, if not in the top 2 models in the entire world. Like I think historically, and this is the challenge for us, is to overcome some of the historical perception about Gemini. But I think we've made up progress and then some, and now across like pretty much most dimensions have the world's most powerful model at each of the brackets of model capabilities. So I think it's on us to go and tell the world that story now and make it very clear to developers. But I think that's been the biggest misconception, is like people are just assume we're behind, not for the wrong reasons, probably for the right reasons. But I think the reality is we're not anymore, which is an exciting place to be.
All right, last one, Logan. What's on your personal hit list for things Gemini can't do, but for sure you would use it yourself? One of the most popular ones when I ask people is they ask when the Tony Stark assistant is coming, which you guys are working on in live mode. It's pretty neat. But that's a common one. People say, oh, I want to be building stuff and just have it watch me and I don't even have to touch the phone, sort of thing. But what's your list? I want to know what's on Logan's mind.
Yeah, I love that one. I think there's definitely a product experience that's close to that. Hopefully that folks will be able to build soon. I think proactivity is the biggest one. I think there's just so much of the magic where if the model was able to see the things that I'm doing and have access to the same data that I would, it would be able to go and come up with a bunch of work without me ever having to have been involved and queue that up for me and let me review that and decide which of it I want to proceed with versus not. I think a lot of that you could do today. I think maybe it'll become more and more possible from a product experience as the model keeps getting better. But I think that's the thing I'm most excited about, is I don't like the idea that we have these intelligent assistants and I have to like dispatch every item of work in the near future. I just think is like not going to be what the world looks like. And yeah, so I'm excited for people who are building that product experience.
Yeah, likewise. I want a personal Trello board powered by Gemini. That sounds great.
It does. I want this. Yeah. I can imagine like the OS layer on computers has this, where like the right quarter of your screen is just the models just like queuing up stuff. And you're just like constantly looking at this and being like, okay, here are 15 tasks the model came up with that it might do based on everything that's coming into you. And which of these do you want to approve versus deny versus send a follow-up that maybe tweak a couple of these things and come back to me. I think that product experience is going to be really magical.
That would be fantastic. That's exactly what I need, man, because I'm overwhelmed. The closest thing we're getting now is on Gemini. I open the voice, not live mode, but voice, and I can ask it about my emails and it rates them down for me. But once that's in the OS, that's going to be killer. That'll be so cool.
I'm excited.
Yeah. Logan, it was a pleasure having you on. I could talk for another hour about the amazing thing you and the product team are working on here, but we'll hopefully have you again on soon. And people will want to know where they can hear from you because you mentioned Twitter, right? So what's your handle? Do you post anywhere else? Do you blog anywhere else?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, official Logan K, or if you just look up Logan Kilpatrick, you'll find all the places that I'm on the internet. So I'm everywhere all the time. So please email me or ping me or whatever it is if our team can be helpful on all things Gemini. We're pushing the rock up the hill on lots of stuff. So would love to be helpful to folks who need things.
Awesome. And we can throw Logan's email and name down in the show notes if anybody's curious. It's been a pleasure, Logan. Thank you again for coming on and giving us your time to talk about Gemini and all the great things coming.
Thank you, Paul. This was a ton of fun. Thanks for having me.